Chesapeake is an American Indian term meaning Great Shellfish Bay, aptly describing that bounty for which our Chesapeake Bay has become so famous. But this historic Chesapeake country has spawned a lot more than the makings for great crab feasts and oyster roasts, and has an aura, complexity, and kaleidoscopic beauty that artists, wordsmiths, and photographers have struggled to capture for centuries. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary on the east coast of the United States. Its salty tidewaters move along with predictable rhythms, meeting and mingling with fresh waters delivered by currents from 48 rivers and countless branches and streams along its path. These intersecting nautical avenues and alleys have long invited exploration and settlement. Still today, some bear names that roll with reverence to the Native Americans who first occupied their shores. Others, like the Chester River, boast of English ancestry, dating back to 17th century settlers who built comfortable cradles nearby, establishing colonial hometowns, really, from which grew one of the greatest nations on earth, the United States of America. Chestertown, Maryland began as one of those Anglican cradles of American history. As a mighty arm of the Atlantic, the Chesapeake Bay separates from the U.S. mainland 180 miles of land along the eastern shore of 3 states, forming what has unofficially been named the Delmarva Peninsula. Chestertown is alluringly located there in Kent County, Maryland, adjacent to the Chester River. Previously known as Newtown, settlers utilized its shores for trade and commerce as early as 1635, 140 years before the first shots were fired in our War for Independence. Its oldest remaining house, affectionately known as Rock of Ages, was built in 1696. The port of Chester was officially established in 1706, and it was ordered that a town be laid out. This treasured late 18th century painting depicts early Chestertown and Washington College's original structure, and reflects the town's agricultural and nautical heritage. In the foreground, Simon Wilmer sits astride a horse on the family estate, Stepney Manor, also known as White House Farm, on whose lands the town and college were built. The painting also gently hints at Chestertown's strong equestrian history. In the town's earliest days, racing was a popular sporting event held regularly near the Chester River. These trotters, being put through their paces today, seem to sense a lingering excitement from the harness races that were held here at Stepney Manor even before the Revolution. For 2 centuries, when waterways were our only avenues of commerce and transportation, Chestertown and Annapolis, Maryland, served as major ports of entry for the Chesapeake Bay area. Imagine the international flavor that must have prevailed here, where Chestertown's original customs house, now gone, once stood for an undetermined period of time before and after being joined by this structure built in 1746. What anticipation, then joy there must have been as vessels arrived, carrying culinary, cloth, and other cultural imports from around the world to the colonial provinces. And it must be concluded that merchants and others seeking refreshment and comfort nearby had their needs nicely met at the White Swan Tavern, located just a few short blocks from the docks. Though it keeps its exact age a secret, this carefully restored old tavern, now a bed and breakfast, is thought to have been used prior to 1733 as a tannery, then converted to a tavern around 1793. Not surprisingly, many town residents began to accumulate a taste for finery and good living, as well as the means to obtain it. These 18th and 19th century homes along Water Street were built by wealthy shipping merchants between 1770 and 1883, and still they echo with the elegance of that gracious past. Water Street also echoes with the angry cries of Chestertown citizens protesting the closing of Boston's port following its famous Tea Party. In further provincial defiance to the British, on May 23, 1774, Chestertown held its own Tea Party.
We cannot stand by and watch the closing of the ports of Boston any more than we could watch the closing of the ports of Chestertown.
You, sir, are preaching treason.
Is all we to live free in our home, or are we to suffer under the whims and fancies of our cousins in England who know nothing of our lives here? Yes!
Yes! We are not being persecuted, we are being protected. The Parliament operates for our benefit.
If we do not act now while we can, we shall lose our pride and our self-respect.
The people of Chestertown have wrestled with this issue, and we have decided there remains but one alternative, and that is to do as our courageous brothers in Boston have done and throw the tea into the river.
Dump the tea.
Dump the tea in the river!
As the town grew and flourished, it developed a unique cultural ambiance. Manor house breeding and taste merged with colonial hardiness and charm, while absorbing the salty savor of the Eastern Shore's relaxed independence, giving Chestertown an air of sophistication, but without a pretentious swagger. From the time of its inception, Chestertown has had a healthy appetite for education and boasts of being home to Washington College, founded in 1782, just 1 year after the colonists had won their independence.
Washington College is named for George Washington. It's the only institution that he ever gave his name to. It's the first college that was started after the Revolution that has survived to the present day. In that sense, just as the first baby born after the beginning of the year is the first baby of that year, so we're the first college of the United States of America.
The Emmanuel Protestant Episcopal Church near Chestertown's Central Square stands in testimony to our country's strong religious core. A tablet reminds us that at this location, the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States adapted its name in 1780 to distinguish itself from the Church of England. Other town monuments remind us that preserving our freedom and growing a strong nation has required constant vigilance and sometimes great sacrifices. Time moved on, and it became a challenge for Chestertown to maintain its worldly focus, as highway systems replaced the waterways, and ironically, the rivers and the bay were viewed as obstacles to commerce and transportation, rather than assets. But there were many creature comforts to living on Maryland's eastern shore, and like other shore people, Chestertown's residents considered tranquility, which was enhanced by their relative isolation from the mainland, to be one of them. But in 1940, the Eastern Shore, like the rest of the country, found itself still reeling from the Great Depression.
In late 1939, it became obvious that the Kent and Queen Anne's Hospital was not large enough to serve the needs of the citizens. So they needed to have a fundraiser. The hospital auxiliary came up with an ingenious idea of hiring a company to make a hometown movie of Chestertown, which was wonderful for the citizens. They were ecstatic. They could all come and be in the movie, which they indeed were, and they could show their strong support of the community and the hospital as well. They shot 4 days, 2 in early February and 2 in late February.
Some funds were quickly raised from the sale of tickets to several local showings in February of 1940. But later, the film took on a life of its own and became far more valuable as a precious visual record, a nostalgic reflection of the naivete of that time bygone. For 1940 proved to be a monumental turning point in world history. As the Amateur Service Production Company approached Chestertown on Highway 213, crossing the Chester River Bridge, they were introduced to the town's historic ambiance by the magnificent old houses on Water Street, as well as the river itself. Continuing into town, they had no idea that what they were about to record was the end of another era of history, not only in Chestertown, but throughout the USA and around the world.
Coming across the bridge, funny.
It looks very much the same.
And there's my house. Wonderful. I'm so glad when they've kept those lamps that were on the bridge, too. The Customs House looks a little different now than it did then.
Yeah, no porch now.
And it's been cleaned up considerably. Well, do you remember the Sophie Fisher Inn that Mr. Ned and Miss Sophie had? It was a wonderful place, apparently. And there's Cross Street. Oh, that's Maple Avenue also, then going up to Spring. Oh, that's Mr. Bill Holden's Sunoco station.
Also a good place to get penny candy.
I remember 1940. I was 10 years old, and it was a happy time in many ways. I don't think that probably my cousins and my family, as children, really realized how devastating the Depression had been in many ways. Our parents had kind of shielded us from that a great deal.
It was just before World War II, and the town stayed the same until after World War II because of the war drive. You had a war on, as they say, and things didn't change. So in my growing up, I lived in a kind of frozen time of about 6 years that my life didn't change because the landscape, the townscape didn't change.
Chestertown in the 1940s was a wonderful place to live. It was a little town of probably 2,500 people. It was a simple rural life that was just marvelous. Everybody knew everybody else. People had lived here for generations. You'd pick up the telephone and the operator would say, "Number, please," and you'd give a 3-digit number. And you knew the operator and she'd call you by name half the time. Chestertown was really not a tourist place at all. When I grew up, people didn't come to Chestertown to look at the old houses or the little shops or antiques or things like that. There were always antique shops, and there were always the old houses, but no one paid much attention to them in those days.
In the first census of the United States, Chestertown was the geographical center of the first census. Now I think the geographical center is out in Missouri somewhere as it's moved with the population.
You know, one of the reasons this place was so busy is this Route 213 over here. It was a major colonial military route, north-south, and it was really sort of the superhighway of the times. It connected Maryland and all points south with New York, Philadelphia, Boston. So it was in heavy usage. That's George Washington was up and down this route between Philadelphia and New York and his home in Virginia. It's one reason he took such an interest in this area is he was very familiar with it.
One thing I remember, how few automobiles there were on the street. Nowadays the street is full of automobiles. Downtown Chestertown has street lights. In those days there were no street lights. There was angle parking. You could ride your bike up and down the street, didn't have to worry about automobiles. You could jaywalk, didn't have to cross on the corners. Other things I had forgotten, the stop signs. Nowadays they're red. In those days they used to be yellow with black letters. And how much bigger the direction signs are of how to get to Rock Hall or Still Pond. They were little small signs because cars didn't drive very fast.
This is High Street, looking from Cross Street down. Look at the foot traffic.
Notice everybody has on a hat.
Your mother and my mother never went to the grocery store without a hat on, my dear. This must be a Saturday. There's the college students.
This is the main street. And in those days, the main street was really the center of commerce and business. Unlike today, when the food stores are located outside of town. In those days, my mother could walk to the food store, to the drugstore, to the clothing store. And I'm also struck by the fact that now, after 5 o'clock, it's hard to find anyone on the streets in Chestertown.
Well, downtown Chestertown, it was quite a lot of people. More people living there then than it is now. Well, today it is primarily business.
World's Tavern is right on the corner of Cannon and Queen Street, and I was born on Queen Street, 107 South Queen Street.
In 1940, I was 10 years old, enjoying every bit of Chestertown, living on Cannon Street. We had a tree-lined street at the time, and we used to play out under those trees. Volleyball, baseball, anything that you could think of in the sport line, running, jumping, we had a very good time. Most of us girls at that time used to go to the top of the hill and have a beauty shop and stay up there practically all day long, just playing beautician.
This is a wonderful area to live in. When I was younger, I didn't appreciate it. You probably hear a lot of people say that about the areas that they live in, but there are very few areas within the state of Maryland, I think, that can even hold a candle to this area. The 1940s film is a great record of history. However, when you look at history, history means everything. It's not history if it's not inclusive. And when that film was done, the African American community was omitted. Actually, in those times, until after 1960 and the great civil rights movement, this was happening everywhere. But we're in a new time these days, and it's good to see that efforts are being made and that it's being recognized, and people want to take the opportunity to correct those omissions.
My parents were the Smiths, and the Smiths had on Cannon Street a restaurant and what we call then a beer garden, which is now, of course, a tavern. So therefore, they sold food as well as beer and sodas. And that's the way I grew up.
When I came along, I knew that there were certain places we couldn't go. And you just didn't expect to go because you weren't ever going. Like there was a theater here, well, the blacks couldn't go. So you never thought about it because you never knew, hardly knew it was down there, one of those kind of things.
My parents, being self-employed individuals, provided us with our basic needs, and we got an opportunity to go where we wanted to go with the rest of our friends, and we also had an opportunity to do most anything we wanted to do.
Where I live on Calvert Street, the next street over, the whites lived, and we talked with each other. My grandmother would talk with them. They'd come by and sit on our porch, and I grew up with boys and girls in the town here.
In those days, particularly on Friday and Saturday nights, the farmers used to come to town, park their cars nose in, as you see, on the main street,
You park it in an
and they
angle.
would sit there and watch.
Mhm.
Now, you were in a farm family, so
On
maybe...
farm family, I came in on Saturday night if they were going to do shopping, and you visited each car because there was a grandmother in the car, or an aunt, or an older lady that hadn't been out all week and came to town, and sitting in back of one of these cars was the highlight of my life. You brought eggs to town to trade for groceries, and the list at the grocery store, you had a long list, and you would give it to the clerk, and he would look at everything on the list and one by one get it off the shelf. Now, when I was young and 16 or 17, I would divide my list in 3 parts so I could go to the store 3 times and meet the fellow I'm married to now. I would tear it so he'd have to wait on me 3 times.
The Voschel House, Mr. Charlie Eshman's Voschel House. That was where everybody stayed when they came to town, the traveling salesmen, etc.
The Voschel House, at least as far as the kid was concerned, was an ancient building, a 3-story building where the People's Bank stands today. My recollection of it is that as you went in the front door, which is where the front door of the People's Bank is, you went up a flight of stairs to the main floor of the building, and incidentally there were shops and offices on the lower floor that were not a part of the hotel.
In 1940, Chestertown was a pretty quiet place. We knew that there was a war on in Europe because you heard it on the radio, but wasn't much talk of it locally. But that spring, I came down with scarlet fever. And in those days, when you had scarlet fever, you had to stay in a dark room. You couldn't read. The curtains were pulled down. So there was nothing to do but listen to the radio. And I listened to Jack Armstrong, at night, Baby Snooks, a number of programs, but during the day, mostly news. And at this point was the fall of France. So I followed the fall of France, the German army through France, the fall of France, the Battle of Dunkirk on the radio. And by the end of it, it was May, the windows were open, and people would come by and yell up to me, "What's happened? What's the latest news?" Because it was the news for the block.
I'm struck with the thought that had I been Rip Van Winkle in 1940, and had I gone to sleep, and had I awakened 58 years later in 1998, I would have recognized Chestertown as it was when I was a boy. There is a difference, though, I think, in its character, because it's now much more cosmopolitan. In 1940, it really was a fairly provincial place. In other words, the English settlers had predominated on the eastern shore, and we had no contact with other immigration streams that came to this country. And so when I left here and went away and went in the service, people kidded me about my accent, which has now become more homogenized. In other words, when I left here, if I can still say this right, I was saying things like about and house, because that's the way we talk then. And now that sort of seems to have gone.
Now we're looking south toward the river.
And that's the park before, when it had cement walks. We used to roller skate there.
That's right.
And there I am roller skating up the street.
The pep parade has really some marvelous animals in it, along with the dogs and the cats and the raccoons. But the farm kids came to town and brought a lot of their little pets and paraded around the town park. And yeah, I thought it was a wonderful parade, and the kids really enjoyed it. The raccoon, which hung to the young lady's shoulders, won first prize. The mayor and town council were there to judge the parade, of course, and I thought their attire was interesting because everybody wore those coats in those days, those long knee-length coats, fedora hats. When we've gone to an era now when no one wears a hat anymore, everybody wore a hat. You know, you bent it down at the top. They were there. Ann Wilmer, Hoon's father, Phil Wilmer, who was mayor of Chestertown longer than any other person.
The mayor and council was a very important part of life in those days. The decisions were made by the town council as to what activities happened in the town. And at that time, the mayor and council were all men, and they were older men who were leaders of the community, business leaders of the community. Today's mayor and council, the demographics have changed enormously. There are 2 women and 3 men. One of the men is a black, and the mayor is a woman, which shows a change in times from 1940 till today. A new way of thinking and looking and voting.
The old elementary school was at 400 High Street. That's where we started in the 1st grade. That's where we ended up in the 7th grade.
The windows you see up there were Miss Loud's office.
That's right.
And she was our principal at elementary school.
Of the elementary school. Miss Loud was a very stern lady.
She clapped her hands, you got in your seat. There wasn't any looking and doubting her. If we doubted, I don't know what would have happened. I loved the lady. I thought she was the greatest thing.
And this looks like the 1st or 2nd grade coming out of there. I love their clothes. Everybody's very orderly and comes out without any pushing and shoving, and I love the aviators caps. They are wonderful with the goggles, leather aviators caps. They were the envy of everyone.
They were called Lindbergh hats, and you had goggles on them, and you always hoped it would snow so you could pull the goggles down.
And the corduroy knickers that swooshed when people walked. Yes, they were heaven. Yes. And they wore high-top boots with laces, and then they had a little slot down the side for your penknife. And I can remember just envying the boys so that they were allowed to have these, because my mother would never allow me to have high-top boots with a slot for a penknife.
One of the thrills, you might say, was when we had a fire drill, because the tube came down from the 3rd floor in the back of the building, and there was a junction at the 2nd floor, so depending on which floor you were, that indicated how long a ride you got. And then some of the older boys were stationed at the bottom to catch the people as they came down, and Miss Loud was standing there pushing the kids that were scared into the fire escape. And I remember some of the guys wanted to be down at the bottom so that they could observe the girls as they came down, sliding down the fire escape. Now, I wasn't in that group, you understand, but there were some.
And the patrolman was, a person in patrol, was supposed to keep them in line, and it was a sort of a fun time in school.
There was segregation, as you know, and my grandmother came here in 1911, and she taught in a small village outside of Chestertown known as Still Pond. She was promoted to be the supervisor of the black schools. Every community in Kent County had a black school, one-room school. My grandmother wrote a letter to the legislature asking that a school be built, a high school be built here in Chestertown. I went to elementary school in this building that you see here. The elementary and high school were housed in one building. You graduated with a certificate from the 7th grade. Then you were promoted to high school. We went to the 2nd floor, the high school. There was no high school until this high school was built. If the children finished elementary school, which they mostly did, they had to go to the city where some of their relatives lived in order to get a higher education.
Garnet High School was totally black. It had not only all black students, but as well all black teachers. It was a school that was very good. We had very good teachers who cared about us.
When I started first grade, I attended Garnet, and through second grade, and the schools were segregated. I had all black teachers, all black students. The principal was black, and every method of education was familiar to my culture. However, when I got to the third grade, it was a great change. My third grade teacher was a white lady by the name of Lucille Price. I'll always remember that. And it was a good first experience, which I was very blessed to have that, because I do know that there were some children that didn't have that experience. And I would say that I'm sure that was black children, white children as well as blacks. That was a great change. But from the third grade on, schools were integrated. I think children are always more receptive to change. Children welcome change. And if you pay close enough attention to them, they will teach you how to change the right way, if we'll just leave them alone instead of inflicting our ideas upon them. In Wharton Point, the one-room schoolhouse still stands. It is 108 years old, and it is probably one of, so far in my research that I've been able to find, of the one-room colored schoolhouses left in Kent County, one of three, though there were many. 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to begin a dream that I've had for a very long time, and that is that I became the founder of the African American Heritage Council of Kent County. The reasons for that is to preserve the history of the African American community, because the African Americans that came before us played just as a vital role in the forming and shaping of the entire Kent County community. They had businesses. They were very strong church leaders. Mrs. Thelma Wilson's family, it's because of her grandmother that education continued beyond the 7th grade for African Americans. So the exhibit that I have now is housed there. I have photographs that date back to the mid-1800s. The information that I am finding is tucked deeply away. I at first thought that it was all lost, but I began to find out that it is tucked so deeply away into the memories of all of the family members, in their photographs, in the stories that they shared year after year, well, say generation after generation. There is no history if we don't make history, if we don't value history. And in order to do that, we have to start by valuing the life that we live today.
And that's Chestertown High School, which is now the Board of Education building. And look at those wonderful buses there, getting ready to line up to take the bus children home.
In relation to today's facilities, it was very primitive. The shop class was in the basement. One of my first projects was to make a doorstop that looked like a cat, and I still have it. And it has on the back the date 1942.
Boys in neckties. There was no dress code in those days. It was just the way everyone dressed. Boys in ties, girls in skirts.
You finished high school and went to college after the 11th grade. And this, I guess, was only in Maryland. I know it was on the Eastern Shore because I know the Washington College had the smallest graduating class in 1954 because that was the first year that Maryland Public Schools went to 12 grades. Washington College has always been a big, big part of Chestertown. Not only did an enormous number of local people go there to college, but it also brought the outside world to Chestertown to a certain degree. We had a great number of people who came from Connecticut and a great number of people who came from New Jersey. But the majority of the people really were from the state of Maryland and an awful lot of Eastern Shore people. But it broadened everybody's outlook.
Classes were all held in William Smith Hall in those days, and before the class would start, we used to hang out the open windows and yell comments to classmates approaching and survey the incoming crop of freshman girls. If you had a date with a girl, you had to go in the lobby of Reed Hall, and Miss Minnie would come and look you over, and then she would summon the girl downstairs for the date. Social life for a guy without a car, such as I was restricted to going to dances there on Friday and Saturday night.
We didn't have any cars of our own, so you'd have to con the parents out of a car.
Well, I remember one night you were driving, and it was you and myself, and we were coming into town, and we were up there by Reed Hall, and we were really exceeding the speed limit, and I was scared to death. I don't know if you remember that.
30 miles an hour.
Oh, you were going a lot more than 30.
We'd drive around town. Of course, there wasn't a lot of places to go, and the town wasn't as big as it is now. You'd cruise around a few streets and then hop into Gill Brothers, because that's where the crowd was.
Oh, it was always some action here. After school, weekends, anytime you could. So many things that have happened, but I'll tell you one thing. I'll make a statement that I wouldn't trade my childhood growing up in Chestertown for all the money in the world or anything. And I mean it, and I absolutely mean that.
The college played basketball at the Armory because the college gym had gotten too small for the crowds. So the basketball games were down there. After the basketball game, college students would run from the Armory to Gill Brothers in order to grab a table.
They were in and out, some standing outside, and then later on had the downstairs, where they had the dance floor downstairs.
It was a great Bobby Soxers hangout, a great era where you went after school and went down in the basement and jitterbug to Tommy Dorsey and Jimmy Dorsey and Glenn Miller, and sodas came down on a dumbwaiter, and that great era.
Once we got out, that's what we wanted to do. All we wanted to do was get where the music was and to play the jukebox, and then you could play put a nickel in the jukebox and it would play a whole song. The Rainpours then, as was commonly known then, was in Wharton, Maryland, a place called Butlertown. And it was a gathering place for folks to go to on weekends, especially on Fridays and Saturdays. It was a small building, and it had tables inside and a jukebox. And we used to love to dance. Once we were old enough to go in those places.
Gill Brothers began its days around 1920, right at the beginning of the flapper era, and it went to approximately 1952.
My father and my uncle owned the store, and some nights they'd have freshman night, and have peanuts and everything for the college kids.
Yeah, and we was throwing them at everybody. It was good times.
I worked behind the fountain there until about 11 o'clock at night, 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and Saturday and Sunday we'd have to work just about all day, or especially Saturday.
If I ask these girls here now, you want to work Saturday night? They know exactly what I mean. I think we grew up at the right time with the right friends and the right family. This street meant a lot to us. This was Cross Street, where everybody worked Friday night and Saturday night, particularly Saturday night.
Yeah, you're right, John.
And it was a college hangout, it was a local hangout. Ice cream cones were 10 cents.
Yeah.
Milk was 11 cents a gallon. A quart of ice cream was 50 cents. Strawberry ice cream had real strawberries. The peach ice cream had real peaches. It was delightful. They built this place down the street in 1925, the factory.
They bottled milk, chocolate milk, made of various flavors of ice cream. Milk was shipped in by local farmers, including my granddaddy. They start out in round milk bottles with embossments and ended their days with a painted milk bottle that had a poem around the Second World War. And the poem was, "Once upon a time there was a little girl whose skin was fine as silk. For every day beside her plate was a glass of Gill Brothers milk."
When we opened Played Against Sam originally, we knew nothing of the Gill Brothers. existence and the popularity that, that exists in this community. So when the doors opened and the story started to come in, we were very excited to know that this space in its day had many memories, first loves, last loves. It's wonderful to know that we're here and to be able to have that space and provide, hopefully, those same memories again.
Well, the Armory was somewhat a center of activity for the town. Our Boy Scout troop met in the basement of the Armory on Wednesday. Actually, there were 3 troops in Chestertown because there was a black troop. Scouting was very big. Right here are the Girl Scouts standing in front of the firehouse. And again, notice they're all in uniform, berets.
I think you were allowed to wear your scout uniform to school the day of the scout meetings, but other than that, you weren't allowed to wear your scout uniform to school. Was this true of the Boy Scouts?
Well, you could wear your uniform to school during Boy Scout Week.
Ah.
And everybody looked forward to wearing their uniform because you were proud to be a Boy Scout and you were proud of your rank.
We had a high percentage of boys to go on and to get their Eagle rank, which is the highest rank in scouting for Boy Scouts. We were mighty proud in Troop 130. All of the boys had their own uniforms. It was required that they wear them to the scout meetings to display their scout badges, their merit badges, as well as their rank.
Now you notice also in there that there are some Sea Scouts. I don't know whether there's any Sea Scouts left or not, but Sea Scouts was big in those days. It was a senior scout. You had to be a Boy Scout for 3 years before you could be a Sea Scout.
Troop 130 was preparing to go up to Rodney for a weekend, and we did scout crafts, worked on merit badges, and was always glad to get home because we didn't get much sleep at night as assistant scoutmaster. February of the following year, I became scoutmaster, and we used to have one of the better troops, if not the best troop in the Delmarville Council. I still see today many of those boys around the community, and it's sort of inspiring. And it makes me feel good some of them come back. Mr. Wells, you were our scoutmaster, except now they say, Willis, you were our scoutmaster.
This is the American Legion post. They were sponsors of Troop 130 and much smaller than the Legion hut today.
Well, this is the first Methodist, and up on that step is my husband.
Paul Reynolds was a minister there.
They had large Sunday school classes in those days. There we are. And we didn't get a picture taken very often.
Maybe that's one of the biggest constants in that people went to church in those days and they go to church now.
Yeah, that's true.
In other words, a center of community life.
And which Methodist church is that, Willis?
It's Christ Methodist.
It's Christ Methodist Church. W.P. Roberts, the minister there.
And look at I think that must be a skunk fur coat.
Yeah, that's the second skunk fur coat we've
That's
seen.
on Dorothy Myers.
W.P.
That's
Roberts
Mr.
said he baptized me.
Well, the one wonderful thing about so many of these churches is ministers were here for a long time. Dr. Atwood at Emmanuel Church married my mother and father, baptized me, saw me confirmed, married me, and baptized my oldest child. A great number of Episcopal churches on the Eastern Shore that are all as old or older than Emmanuel. And then Emmanuel was refurbished in the 1880s, was built in the 1700s, and then they modernized it in the 1880s and took away a great many of the old colonial things.
I like the fashions of this. The fur coats were coming out of the church in Now we can't wear fur coats without people being upset about it.
That Sacred Heart Church on High Street, the Reverend Father Conway was there for a number of years. And right across the street from the church, there was a family by the name of Schauber. They had 16 children, all living at one time.
And half of them are coming down the steps when and I think they have a new baby. Everybody looks at the new baby as it comes down the steps.
And the men are all very well dressed, and so everybody is very well dressed, and lovely hats.
Chestertown's always been a church-going town.
And at that time, they didn't have Saturday night mass.
Well, I think everybody was much more formal in those days. No one called anybody by their first names in those days.
I am a member of James United Methodist Church and have been a member since I was about 3 years old. I can recall a lot of our recreational activities, field trips, was as a result of James's church.
I would just thank the Lord that I'm able, and my kids were able to go to school, and they all attend the James Church, which is in Chestertown.
Our lives revolved around the church a great deal, and a lot of our social life took place as far as the church was concerned. Miss Dorothy Peka had a dress shop, and it was the one place in town that ladies could buy their fashions. There's the hosiery display, and then the spring fashions for 1940. The purses and the dresses, and of course everyone will, as I've said before, have on a hat. And it looks, I bet that's a nice navy blue dress for spring. Those were Chestertown's supermodels, and the marvelous thing about it was in 1940, the Germans took over Paris, so there were no fashions. There were no Cotier collections that year. And I assumed that all the collections and all the fashions came from New York, and I think they're really quite nice. And then this is Priscilla Brown, who was a college student, so she's showing, don't you love her saddle shoes and her socks turned down. And that's a reversible raincoat with a hat to match. Then this is my Aunt Mackie back, and she has on a spring outfit also. And there is Miss Peka. She owned the shop and did all the buying and was considered quite chic. And don't you love her shoes with great high heels, because she was a little bitty woman. I remember her quite well.
My mother and father, Robert and Alma Carroll, started Park Cleaners in 1934, right here in Chestertown on the edge of the park. That's how we became Park Cleaners. The following year, we moved our dry cleaning plant to Kingstown, and this is me in the 1940 film. I'm the second generation. This is my son, David. He is the third generation, and I have grandchildren working in the business also, so that's the fourth generation. And we have about 25 employees now, and we enjoy being in Chestertown. It's a good town to be in.
Sherwin Williams has been in Chestertown for over 55 years, since the early 1940s.
The paint store was on High Street in what is now the building of Richie Bramble's clothing store. When the fellow slapped the paint on the board in there, it looks as if it stayed on there. I'm sure because paint in those days had lead in it. Apparently that shaking machine was relatively modern at that point. Otherwise, I don't think they would have gone to the trouble of, or especially highlighted it in this film.
We have been here approximately 5 years, and we have a much more modern, a bigger facility to better serve our customers. There's a lot more modern ways to do things. We've come a long way in 55 years.
Next to the paint shop, Mrs. Bartley had a store called the Dorothy Card and Gift Shop. I think it was one of maybe only 2 businesses owned at that time by women, the other one being Miss Peka's dress shop. Fox's Five and Dime was one of the real emporiums of Chestertown in those days. It was the store where you could buy almost anything. It was operated by Maurice Fox, who was known locally as Burr Fox. It would be like a department store for a kid today. And in those days, a trip to Wilmington or Baltimore was relatively rare, so we had Mr. Fox's store here in which to find toys and household articles. As I recall, we didn't have credit in those days, but I understand that Mr. Fox would let you buy things that way. At least I remember hearing that in town.
My father and Mr. Fox were very good friends. They right next door to one another. And I remember one time Mr. Fox got a letter from one of his salesmen. It just had a picture of a bee on there and a fox. And he got the letter and sent it to Chestertown. Didn't need any address or nothing.
Stam's drugstore was sort of a central place.
Central place.
When I was quite small, my mother used to get us dressed in the afternoon, and Mrs. Corey, Reese Corey's mother, and we would go uptown to Stam's, and we would sit at those marble-top tables and have ice cream.
Me too.
And then as we got a little older, my brother and I were in the bad habit of getting cigarettes when we were 10, 12 years old, and my dad could call up Miss Clara Biddle in the drugstore and tell her not to sell us any cigarettes unless he had called in advance. That's small town living.
Your life was kind of caught between the drugstore and the movie theater. I live just down the street here, around the corner from the movie theater. And when I went, it was 12 cents. Stam's drugstore is next door where you can still get a vanilla milkshake. Not a quarter anymore.
The ice plant was located at the head of Calvert Street. It was a major business back in those days because not everybody had an electric refrigerator. I know that we didn't. Now we had what we thought was a very modern ice box because it would take a 100-pound block. And the fellow had to get that 100-pound block into the ice box, which sat on the back porch. We used to run out to the truck and get chips of ice in the summertime. The Chestertown restaurant was located on High Street in what is now the Alexander building. The main part of the restaurant was on the first floor. It was operated by George Kellis, who had come from Greece, or perhaps his father had. His wife is still living today in Chestertown, and the Rotary Club met on the second floor. I remember that in particular because there were occasions when my dad, who was a member, would take me to the meetings. My dad was the principal of the high school here when I was growing up, which made for some interesting situations. But I want to point out sort of the continuity of community. He was a member of the Rotary Club and its president in 1943-44, and I found myself occupying the same office in 93-94, exactly 50 years later. And still today, I'm a member of the Chestertown Rotary Club.
Dear God, we thank you for this beautiful day, and particularly for the rain. And we give you thanks for this food and bless the hand that prepared it. And we give you thanks for all the opportunities to serve in Rotary. For these and all the blessings we have, we're very grateful. Amen.
The Chester River Yacht and Country Club was built in 1928. It was located there, as you know, on the bend of the river. The river had long played an important role in Kent County and in Chestertown. The club had two aspects. It was a yacht club and it was a country club. The first golf course in these parts was located in Chestertown, and it was constructed as a 9-hole golf course. Even though I'm not a member of the country club today, I feel very close to it. My dad was an excellent golfer. That sort of talent is not inherited because I was far from good, but he was good enough to win the club championship, I think, 10 times in the 30s and 40s.
We spent a great deal of time on the water, living as close to the water as we did. There were boats of various kinds, and we sailed, we rowed, we swam. We had really an idyllic life in many, many ways. We were very, very fortunate.
I can remember when the steamboat still came down to the foot of High Street in Chestertown and went to Baltimore and stopped up and down the river at various wharfs. and a number of boats used to fly up and down the bay. We call them buy boats. They would buy oysters in the wintertime from the oystermen. I think the steamer stopped sometime in the early 30s. But there were a number of boats that came in and bought tomatoes and took tomatoes to Baltimore to the canneries. And Chestertown was primarily an agricultural center, and I guess we still are.
I would be the fifth generation of my family members that lived on the property that I'm living on now, having acquired that through my grandfather from his grandparents and so on. Apparently the original owners, the white owners of the property, at some point in time after slavery did deed portions of that property to the slaves. It's very private and it's very, very beautiful. It's God's country.
Most of the money in the county comes from agriculture, and even more so then. Back in the 40s, we were a big dairy area, and you can still see a number of silos around the farms, but there is not that much dairying around here anymore. Mostly nowadays it's corn and soybeans rather than mixed agriculture.
The deliveries in town were mostly by the railroad. They had a train that would come in. We used to call it the tri-weekly. Said he'd come in one week and try to get out the next. But actually they did give us very good service. And then also passenger trains, but that didn't last very long.
We didn't use the train particularly, except maybe just to take the children for a little train ride from Kennedyville to Chestertown. But it was not a great mode of transportation. Boats were to a certain degree simply because there was a Tolchester ferry that went to Baltimore.
In those days, we were fairly well isolated. There was no bay bridge. I didn't realize I was isolated. I thought this was the center of the world. I won't say we were insular because we had newspapers. We got the Philadelphia newspaper, we got the Baltimore newspaper, we got the Wilmington newspaper, and there were 3 newspapers in Chestertown.
They were all family owned. The Usselins owned the Kent News, which really is this paper. Russells owned the Enterprise. And the Collinses owned the Transcript. They stayed fairly local, and it was a hot type, so it was a much harder paper to put together. They didn't use many photographs, and they did not usually elaborate too much.
Rarely did the war news intrude. And part of it, I'm sure, is because the space wasn't available.
All the editors went off to war, which was interesting. Bill Usselin was an enlisted man, sergeant, went slugged across Europe, and he actually wrote a column and sent it back to the Kent News. His column was called Looking 'Em Over, and he had a little part of it which was called Notes from a Ragged Cuff. You know, right there. So he would seek out every GI that he possibly could find, or sailor who had a local contact, and he was in England for about a year. What he did was he tried to every time there was anybody from Kent County or Queen Anne's County that he would mention them. So it was a pretty great column from the standpoint of mothers and fathers could see what Johnny was doing. He would go out of his way.
He was Kent's Ernie Pyle.
The peaks and valleys that were there in the 40s of information, when you'd only got it essentially from radio and the newspaper and the movies, you now get it from many, many sectors. And Chestertown was pretty sleepy. I can remember whenever you wanted to really get something out to the people, you had the fire truck went by going ding ding and had a slate on the side telling you what was going on.
The Ladies' Auxiliary was a group of women who assisted the fire department mainly in putting on suppers. My mother was a member of it, and as well as some of her friends. It was interesting to see my little sister walking there in front of the firehouse with my mother.
Here comes the new fire truck.
They
There
couldn't
comes
get-
the older fire truck.
And they couldn't get many more men on there, I don't
That's
believe.
right. I think half the fun of being a fireman was riding on the fire truck.
And this is before the Route 20 was paved.
That's right.
Still, it's a dirt road.
And this was an old house that had been abandoned, and the fire company is demonstrating the strength of their hoses.
That's
There
right.
we're pumping water out of Radcliffe Creek.
It's cold.
I bet it's cold. Well, they've got pretty good pressure there. They're hitting up on the 3rd floor. Now here goes the chimney. So they do have plenty of pressure on that.
What's the significance of the one? There's one white hat, and
he's
then
the chief.
Oh, he's the chief. All right.
Ladder up for rescue. Right there, bringing the rescue down. And they're simulating that somebody has smoke inhalation, and they will put the respirator on them. All right, this is the latest technology of 1940 for getting smoke out of a person's lungs. And again, they used it for people that had been rescued from drowning. And it pumps air in and out automatically. You don't have to do artificial respiration. As I remember, it was called a pull motor.
What is now Radcliffe Mill in 1940 was Brooks's Mill. In those years of the early 40s, I spent summers on the Corey farm, and I can remember that Mr. Corey would load up sacks of grain and transport those sacks of grain in his truck into Brooks's Mill, where they would take them and grind them into cow feed that we would later go back and get. So it was, at least up until sometime in the 40s, an operating mill. Kibler's Coal Yard was run by Mr. Tom Kibler and Mr. Charlie Kibler. They sold wood for people that burned wood stoves. In my earliest days, I can recollect that we had a wood stove in the kitchen for cooking, but we used coal in the furnace when we lived in a house that had a furnace in it. And the coal was delivered in, I would call them metal buckets or baskets, and sometimes in canvas baskets. And the men would have to carry the coal into the basement and dump it into the coal bin. We happened to use hard coal, pea coal. It was not something I liked very much because it was my job and my brother's job to carry the ashes out and dump them in the alley behind the house.
I worked for the post office in Chestertown, Maryland for a number of years.
Postage was either 2 or 3 cents for a first-class letter at that time.
Right. You didn't have to put Chestertown on your letters. If they were local, you just wrote town, and they would get there.
And any out-of-town mail, if you addressed it just Chestertown, Maryland, the resident would get it. You didn't have to have a street address or anything.
Cars leaving the post office were the rural delivery mailmen. Each furnished his own car. Each had a route. And you didn't need anything but the route number. In fact, you didn't even need the route number. If you had your name and Chestertown on it, you would get it. In fact, I lived on a rural route for a while, and I never did know my box number.
My dad worked with Gulf Oil, which was Sidney Turner, and then he went in partnerships with Mr. Turner, and it was known as Turner and Willis.
This location has been an oil terminal since the 20s. It was jointly owned for a while between Atlantic Richfield and the Gulf Oil Corporation. And the people who operated it here were commission agents. They did not own the product, but they received a commission for making deliveries and selling it. In 1940, the operation of this terminal was somewhat different than it is today. The truck would pull up under a tank, which still exists out there, and would load by gravity and then deliver around town. But the manner of operation and the delivery by trucks is pretty much the same as it was then. Today, we use a loading rack and loading arms, and we pump the oil onto the truck using electric motors. That was not the case at that time.
Well, my mother worked at the Eliason Motors. She worked for Mr. Phil Wilmer. She was a secretary there for I don't know how many years, quite a few years out.
In the 1920s, Ford Motor Company wanted to open an office in Chestertown. Several men got together and organized it. Mr. Eliason was the real organizer, and that is for whom Eliason Motors was named. My father was the manager of it for many, many years. They sold cars, trucks, and tractors. They sold Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln.
They had the little skit in there with Charlie Yashman, who ran the Voschel House on High Street. So he had Charlie, and they were great friends, and they had this little new car skit together. But it's interesting that Mr. Wilmer's had that agency, and we had 3 of our main car agencies were all in Chestertown. In the 70s, they all moved out to the periphery.
The tractor in 1940 revolutionized modern farming, and in an agriculture county like this, that tractor, that small, fast tractor, was a very important part of our farming community.
The mule scene took place on the Hubbard farm. I think it's a Walbert farm now, and it involved Weldon Walbert, who's still alive, and Henry Gill, I believe, and a number of other people. And they contrived to put together this kind of Laurel and Hardy skit.
Fox hunting was imported from England and first done on the eastern shore of Maryland. The local master of hounds was Wilbur Hubbard, who owned a pack of hounds called Mr. Hubbard's Kent County Hounds. He was known throughout the United States and even in Europe. He hunted in Ireland and England, I think. He was the oldest master of hounds.
Anywhere in the world, the oldest master.
He had some great hunts here. He had them all through the years, and I remember one time we had thought about having the Kent County News move up to the business park. And so I brought the president from the corporation over to look at the property, and we were up there on the second floor looking at the property, and all of a sudden across the creek on a hill came about 500 foxhounds, and then everybody else in red, side saddle, the whole business. He said, "Did you stage this?" I mean, it was a scene right out of Tom Jones. Mr. Hubbard continued to keep his hunts right up to the end.
He died, I think, at the age of 95 or so. The original Kent and Queen Anne's Hospital was built about 1934. And I think it resulted from the fact that there was no hospital, no medical facility in Chestertown. To give you just a close-up example, when I was born, my mother had to be transported to Easton, which is 37 miles away.
The hospital auxiliary started in 1934, about a year before the hospital opened. Miss Nora Maxwell, who was instrumental in getting the hospital, was instrumental in getting this going too. She used to have these waffle and chicken dinners. All the money went to the auxiliary. And that was the first big money-making things we did. Over the years, they found very innovative ways, and this was a very innovative thing in the 40s. We've had a Christmas shop for 31 years. That's very profitable. Just last week, we had a golf tournament, and I think the overall monies they took in was over $90,000.
Most of the monies that we raised, and I was in charge of the last raising of money, has been given by members of the auxiliary who had worked with the auxiliary for a long while.
The auxiliary has been in place for some time. The foundation is relatively new. They complement each other. They have different fundraising. They actually combine efforts in many ways. These are the same people who belong to the foundation, belong to the auxiliary in a small town. That's the way it works. You start running into yourself after a while.
The first little building was one in which Dr. Dick, who was our local surgeon, the first surgeon, performed 9 operations in one day. And I knew him. He was a great man, and he, in the end, when they had about 5 or 6 doctors there, surgeons and everything, he still went around and turned the lights off at night. And then the wing that went out from it, white, kind of Mount Vernon style, was the one that they were raising the money for the film for in 1940. Then they wrapped around the building as you see now, one wing of it, and then recently they've done the other expansion and built the annex.
We checked the pulse of the community a long time ago, and no one really knew, I think, how much they really wanted to get behind the hospital and make it work here. Today we have a modern, state-of-the-art facility equipped with the finest technology, probably a model for a rural hospital. In the last year we became an affiliate of Johns Hopkins Medicine. We have just learned that we have the highest productivity of any hospital in the state, and we get letters all the time about the praise of the nursing staff and how well our employees represent the hospital and how they provide the care. We also get praise from about our physicians. So the board, I think, of the hospital can be real proud to serve. We have people stand up and say, "I'll do that," and it works very well.
I love Chestertown.
One amazing thing about the band scene is that it has Bob Fleetwood in the fireman's band in 1940. He was a young teacher then, and of course he still today is active in the Kent County Marching Band. Amazing, after 58 years, to be able to do that.
I came to Chestertown to go to Washington College in 1928, and I graduated in 1932. I also played the Chestertown Band as a cornet player. There were about 40 people in the old band, and the uniform they had was a pretty blue uniform with a harp over your nose. Whenever there's more than one band at a place like Ocean City, they compete for prizes, and they're judged on their appearance and on their music and the distance they've traveled. And Chestertown's won its share of them. This band we have now was formed in 1992, I guess, and it's a very good band.
I'd been living here about 2 weeks when the first Tea Party parade was held, and my family wanted me to come downtown and look at the thing, and I had another parade, gee, I don't want to go to that, And I came downtown, and I was absolutely thrilled. It was like traveling back in time to when I was 10 years old. I got the same sort of feeling, and I still get it, and I can't really explain why I'm so moved by it. There is an incredible passion for parades here. I've lived in a lot of places. I've never seen anything quite like it. One of the big draws for parades in Kent County is we have a thing called the Kent County Community Marching Band, and the drum major is this wonderful fellow named Mark Mumford, who's also the clerk of court, and he really gets into this. And out front is this dancing crab, somebody dressed up in a blue crab suit, and it sort of scampers and scuttles down the street. And people absolutely love this, and they cheer and scream and holler at their friends and relatives, and it's wonderful.
As the award-winning Kent County Community Band continues to parade through town, it reminds us all that what remains of utmost importance is how we live today. And after more than 350 years, people are still extremely proud to call Chestertown home.